It's no secret that I like fat bikes. I've ridden them thousands of miles in all types of terrain, from snow to sand to rock gardens and even some jumpy flow trails. While most fat bikes come stock with a rigid fork up front, Rockshox, Manitou, and a few other companies make suspension forks to clear those big meaty tires. Sometimes I ride with a rigid fork, and sometimes I throw on 100 millimeters of added squish from a Rockshox Bluto. I even had a full suspension fat bike for a while. With all of that ride time, I have a pretty good idea of how fat bikes ride with and without suspension across different trail types and conditions. So today we're going to be answering the question, does a fat bike need suspension? The biggest thing to consider when deciding if you need a suspension fork or not is what type of terrain and trails you're riding. So first, let's talk about dirt. The most obvious place you'd probably want suspension is when you're riding on the same trails you'd take your normal mountain bike. Most of my fat bike miles fit into this category, but in the spirit of being a little more scientific, and because I like to tinker on my bike, I decided to do back-to-back runs down the same trail to get a good comparison. The bike I'm on is my Surly ice cream truck with the stock wheels and 4.8-inch tires, and these are set-up tubeless. The segment I'm riding is a little over 2/3 of a mile and drops around 330 feet. It's double-track trail that has a good mix of dirt, sand, and rocky sections. And since it's winter, there are also a few patches of snow, but nothing major. As expected, the run on the suspension fork was quite a bit faster. Not only was it faster, I actually felt like I was more in control the whole time. I wasn't getting bounced around as much as I was on the rigid fork. Fat tires do provide some suspension, but unlike a fork or shock, that suspension is undampened. There's nothing to slow down the compression or the rebound, so it can get pretty bouncy, even if you're at the right tire pressure. Don't get me wrong, rigid forks are a blast and can turn a tame trail into something really terrifying, but I think a suspension fork can make a world of difference if you're mostly riding it on trails like this. However, if you're going to be doing some slower paced exploring or loading it up for a bike packing adventure, a rigid fork is probably the way to go because it gives you some space to hold gear and is one less thing that can fail when you're out in the middle of nowhere. What if you're riding your bike in the snow? I found that the vast majority of the time a suspension fork isn't necessary on the snow. It adds weight that you don't need, and I usually end up blocking it out anyway, which kind of defeats the purpose. The only time I found it useful in snow is on rides where the snow had become super icy and other trail users had caused some post-holing in the snow. It may as well have been a rock garden at that point. It can also be nice to have suspension if you don't get a lot of snow in general. 3 to 4 inches of snow can seem like a good amount, but it's not going to smooth out all of the bumps from rocks and roots underneath. When it comes to sand, my experience is pretty limited to desert washes. That said, unless you're riding on a pristine beach or in sand dunes, I think a suspension fork might actually be a good thing, as you're most likely going to be riding in rocky terrain that usually surrounds those areas. Having ridden in places like St. George and Moab, Utah, the sandy sections were usually just part of a much rockier trail with small drops and bumps everywhere. So in the end, does a fat bike need suspension? Well, the answer is, it depends. If you're using your bike primarily for trail riding, then I would say from experience that a suspension fork can make a major difference in how your fat bike rides and handles the trail. I rode a salsa muckluck with a rigid fork on all kinds of trails and did totally fine. But once I bought a Specialized Fat Boy and it had a Bluto on it, I learned there was a huge difference in the ride experience. But when it comes to bike packing or adventuring and not looking to get too rowdy, then a rigid fork will give you more place to mount things and it'll be less to worry about. If you're mostly riding on groomed snow or in a good amount of powder, a rigid fork is lighter and more efficient. Suspension's not needed. And if you're riding on sand, I can only guess from my limited experience that you'll probably want one because of what's usually around that sandy spot. In the end, fat bikes are super capable no matter how you set them up, so don't spend too long thinking about this and go out and ride yours. Thanks for watching, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.